The gunshot that ended Katherine Keller's old life came not from a pistol, but from her own mouth. The day she stood before the town council of Denver, Colorado in 1876, and tried to speak her deceased father's final wishes. She was 21 years old, auburn-haired and green-eyed, with capable hands that could mend a fence or bake bread with equal skill. But when she opened her mouth to read the words her father had written, her tongue betrayed her as it always had. The first syllable of her name caught in her throat like a fish hook, and the council chamber filled with barely suppressed laughter. Katherine had lived with her stutter since childhood, when a fever nearly took her life and left her with a twisted tongue instead. Her father, Thomas Keller, had never minded. He had been a patient man who ran a modest ranch on the outskirts of Denver, and he had taught his only daughter everything he knew about horses, cattle, and surviving in the untamed West. When he died suddenly of a heart attack 3 weeks prior, Katherine inherited not just his land, but also his debts and his problems. The council meeting was supposed to settle a dispute with a neighboring rancher who claimed Thomas had promised him water rights before his death. All Katherine had to do was present her father's journal, which clearly stated otherwise, and read the relevant passage aloud. She had practiced for days. She had stood before her mirror and forced the words out, one painful syllable at a time. But standing before 12 men who looked at her with expressions ranging from pity to contempt, her carefully rehearsed speech crumbled. The W in water became a series of stuttering attempts that made her face burn red. The council president, a thick-necked man named Morrison, finally held up his hand. "Miss Keller, perhaps you could simply submit the document for our review," he said, his voice dripping with forced patience that barely concealed his irritation. But the neighboring rancher, a weasel-faced man named Cyrus Thornton, stood up. "How do we know she did not forge that entry herself? I knew Thomas Keller for 15 years, and he gave me his word as a gentleman. I will not have his memory tarnished by a daughter who cannot even speak properly." The chamber erupted in murmurs. Katherine felt her hands shaking as she clutched her father's journal. She tried again, forcing air through her tight throat, but the words tangled and twisted. Someone in the back of the room laughed outright. Another man muttered something about women not belonging in business matters. Morrison banged his gavel, but the damage was done. "Given the circumstances," Morrison said, his decision clearly already made, "we find in favor of Mr. Thornton. The water rights will be transferred to his property." This council is adjourned. Katherine stood frozen as the men filed out around her. Some would not even meet her eyes. Others stared at her with undisguised scorn. Thornton brushed past her and said quietly, so only she could hear, "Your father was a fool to think a defective girl could hold onto anything of value. I will buy your land for half what it is worth, and you should thank me for the charity." She stumbled out of the council building into the bright Colorado sunshine, her father's journal pressed against her chest like a shield. The loss of the water rights meant her cattle would not have enough to drink come summer. It meant her ranch would slowly die. It meant everything her father had built would crumble to dust, and all because she could not force words past her traitorous tongue. The town of Denver had grown rapidly in recent years, swelling with miners seeking silver in the nearby mountains and businessmen seeking to profit from them. The streets bustled with wagons and horses, and Katherine walked through the crowd feeling utterly alone. She had lived on the ranch most of her life, coming to town only for supplies or church. Her father had been her whole world, and now that world had been torn away. She made her way to the general store to pick up the few supplies she could still afford. The owner, Mrs. Henshaw, had always been kind to her, never minding her stutter when she carefully counted out her order. But today Mrs. Henshaw's daughter was working the counter, a pretty blonde girl named Violet who had never bothered to hide her disdain for Katherine. "I need flour and coffee," Katherine said, the words coming out relatively smoothly because she had prepared them in advance. Violet looked her up and down. "I heard what happened at the council meeting. My father was there. He said you made quite the spectacle of yourself." Katherine felt her face burning. She reached into her pocket for the coins she had brought. "Honestly, it is almost sad," Violet continued, loud enough that other customers turned to look. "A grown woman who cannot even talk properly trying to run a ranch. What did you think would happen? This is a man's world, Katherine. Perhaps you should find yourself a husband to speak for you, though I cannot imagine who would want a wife who sounds like a broken music box." The other customers were staring now. Katherine's fingers fumbled with the coins, and several fell to the floor. As she bent to pick them up, she heard Violet say to another customer, "She is pathetic, truly. Her father spoiled her, letting her think she could be something other than what she is." Katherine left the coins on the counter, grabbed her supplies without waiting for change, and fled. Behind her, she heard Violet's laughter mixing with others. The sound followed her out into the street, echoing in her ears even after she could no longer physically hear it. She loaded her supplies onto her wagon with shaking hands. The ranch was an hour's ride from town, and she had never been more eager to retreat to its isolation. But as she climbed onto the driver's seat, she saw a group of men from the council meeting standing outside the saloon. When they spotted her, one of them called out, "There goes the stuttering ranch girl. Best sell while you can, Miss Keller. That land will be worthless by summer." Another man made exaggerated stuttering sounds, and they all laughed. Katherine snapped the reins harder than necessary, and her horse jerked forward. Tears blurred her vision as she guided the wagon through the streets of Denver, past the fine houses and busy shops, past the church where she had attended services with her father every Sunday, past all the places where she no longer felt welcome. The ride home gave her time to think, though her thoughts were dark companions. The ranch came into view as the sun began its descent toward the mountains. It was not a grand property, but it was well maintained, with a sturdy house her father had built with his own hands, a barn that housed 6 horses and 20 head of cattle, and fields that had always provided enough hay to see them through winter. She had loved this place her whole life. Now she saw it through different eyes, understanding for the first time how precarious her hold on it truly was. She unhitched the horse and hauled her supplies inside, then stood in the kitchen that still smelled faintly of her father's tobacco and morning coffee. His jacket still hung by the door. His coffee cup still sat by the wash basin where he had left it that final morning. Katherine sank into a chair and finally let herself cry, great gasping sobs that shook her whole body. She cried for her father, taken too soon. She cried for her humiliation in the council chamber. She cried for Violet's casual cruelty and the laughter of men who saw her as nothing more than a source of amusement. But most of all, she cried because she knew that, without those water rights, she would lose everything, and there was nothing she could do about it. No one in Denver would help her. No one there even respected her. The next morning, Katherine woke with gritty eyes and a hollow feeling in her chest. She went through the motions of her daily chores, feeding the horses, checking on the cattle, mending a section of fence that had come loose. The work usually brought her peace, but today it felt like tending a garden she knew would soon be paved over. As she worked, she made a decision. She would not sell to Thornton for half value. She would not give him the satisfaction. Instead, she would pack what she could carry and leave Colorado entirely. Perhaps in California or Oregon, She could start fresh where no one knew her as the stuttering ranch girl who could not hold onto her inheritance. She was hauling water from the well when she heard a horse approaching. Visitors were rare, and her heart sank, expecting Thornton come to gloat or pressure her to sell. But the rider who came into view was unfamiliar, a tall man on a buckskin horse, leading a pack mule behind him. He rode with the easy confidence of someone who had spent most of his life in the saddle. As he drew closer, Katherine could make out more details. He was probably in his mid-20s, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and sharp features that might have been handsome if not for the weariness etched into them. He wore typical cowboy gear, a worn hat, dusty leather vest over a blue shirt, and a gun belt that sat comfortable on his hips. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, a striking pale blue that seemed to take in everything at once. He reined in his horse a respectful distance from where she stood and touched the brim of his hat. "Afternoon, miss. Would this be the Keller Ranch?" Katherine nodded, her throat already tightening with anxiety. She hated meeting strangers, hated the inevitable moment when she would have to speak and watch their expression change. "My name is Preston Emory," the man said. "I am looking for Thomas Keller. I have a letter of introduction from a mutual acquaintance in Wyoming." Katherine's heart clenched. She swallowed hard and forced out the words she had said too many times in recent weeks. "My father, he passed." The words came haltingly, but at least they came. Preston's expression softened immediately. "I am very sorry to hear that. Thomas and I never met, but my former employer spoke highly of him. I was hoping he might have worked for an experienced ranch hand." Katherine studied him more carefully. He looked tired and dust-covered, like he had been traveling for days. The pack mule carried what appeared to be all his worldly possessions. She should send him away. She was planning to leave herself, after all. But something in his direct gaze made her hesitate. He had not looked away when she stuttered. He had not flinched or smirked or shown any of the reactions she had come to expect. I cannot." She stopped, frustrated with herself. She took a breath and tried again. "No money to pay." Preston nodded slowly. "I understand, these are hard times for small ranches. I apologize for intruding on your grief." He started to turn his horse, but Katherine surprised herself by raising her hand. "Wait," she managed, the single word coming out clearly. He paused, looking back at her with those unsettling blue eyes. Katherine gestured toward the barn, then the fields, trying to communicate without words. She pointed to the water trough, which was only half full, then made a gesture meant to indicate it drying up. Preston followed her movements, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Water trouble?" he asked. She nodded vigorously, relieved to be understood. "That is a difficult problem," Preston said. He dismounted and walked closer, moving slowly as if approaching a skittish horse. "May I?" He gestured to the well. Katherine nodded again. Preston peered down into the well, then walked the perimeter of the property, his eyes scanning the land with a practiced assessment. Katherine followed at a distance, watching him work. He moved with purpose, occasionally crouching to examine the ground or shading his eyes to look toward the mountains. Finally, he returned to where she stood. "Your well is good, but you are right to worry. Come summer, this much water will not sustain your herd." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I noticed you have trouble speaking, miss. I hope you will forgive my directness, but I want you to know it does not bother me. My younger sister had a similar difficulty. Different cause, maybe, but the same struggle with words. I learned patience from her." Katherine stared at him. In her entire life, no one outside her father had ever acknowledged her stutter with such casual kindness. Most people either ignored it pointedly or made it the focus of every interaction. Preston simply stated it as a fact and moved on. "If you are willing," he continued, "I could stay on for a few weeks. No pay needed. Just room and board. I am headed to California eventually, but I am in no particular hurry. Maybe I could help you figure out a solution to your water problem before I move on." Consider it repayment for Thomas Keller's good reputation, which opened doors for me even though we never met. Katherine wanted to ask why. Why would he help a stranger? Why would he stay at a failing ranch with a woman who could barely string 3 words together? But the questions were too complex for her struggling tongue, so she simply nodded and pointed toward the barn, indicating he could stable his animals there. Preston smiled, and it transformed his weary face entirely. "Thank you, Miss Keller. I promise I will earn my keep." Over the next few days, Katherine discovered that Preston Emory was a man of his word. He rose before dawn and worked until sunset, repairing fences, tending the horses, and inventorying the ranch's resources with a thoroughness that impressed her. He spoke to her often but never required lengthy responses, seeming content with her nods and gestures. When she did speak, he waited patiently through her struggles, his expression never changing, his attention never wavering. On the 3rd evening, as they sat on the porch after supper, Preston asked about the water rights dispute. Katherine had prepared for this, writing out the story in her father's journal since speaking it was too difficult. She handed him the journal, pointing to the relevant pages. Preston read in silence, his jaw tightening as he absorbed the details. "This Thornton sounds like a snake," he said finally, "and the council had no right to rule against clear written evidence just because you have difficulty speaking. That is not justice." Katherine shrugged, a gesture that conveyed resignation. She had accepted this was how the world worked. "No," Preston said firmly, "do not do that. Do not accept their cruelty as inevitable. You were wronged, Miss Keller, that matters." She looked at him, startled by the intensity in his voice. In the fading light, his eyes seemed to glow. "My sister," Preston said slowly, "was treated poorly by people who should have protected her. People who mocked her differences and made her feel less than human. I was young and could not defend her the way I should have. She died when I was 16, and I have regretted my silence every day since. So no, I will not sit here and let you believe you deserve what happened in that council chamber." Katherine felt tears prickling her eyes. She wanted to tell him that his words meant more than he could know, that his simple declaration of her worth was a gift beyond measure. But the words locked in her throat, so she did what she had always done. She nodded and looked away. Preston seemed to understand. He leaned back in his chair and changed the subject to lighter matters, telling her stories of his travels through Wyoming and Montana, describing landscapes and people with a storyteller's gift. Katherine listened and felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. For the first time since her father's death, she did not feel entirely alone. A week after Preston's arrival, they rode together to check on the cattle grazing in the eastern pasture. The herd looked healthy, but as Preston had predicted, the grass was already showing signs of drought stress. They would need more water, and soon. "There is a stream that runs through Thornton's property," Preston said, shading his eyes to look toward the neighboring ranch. "If I am reading the land correctly, it originates in the mountains and flows right past your boundary line before reaching his land." "Is that the water source your father's agreement addressed?" Katherine nodded. "And Thornton claims your father promised him exclusive rights." Another nod. Preston was quiet for a moment. "Would you be willing to ride into town with me tomorrow?" "I have an idea, but I will need your permission to pursue it." Katherine tensed. The thought of returning to Denver, of facing the people who had humiliated her, made her stomach churn. But Preston had asked, not demanded. He was looking at her with those steady blue eyes, waiting for her answer without pressure. She nodded, even though fear was already coiling in her belly. The ride to Denver the next morning was quiet but not uncomfortable. Preston seemed to sense her anxiety and kept up a stream of gentle conversation that required little response. He told her about a town in Montana where he had worked for 6 months, about an ornery bull that had chased him up a tree, about a poker game that had gone hilariously wrong. His stories were clearly meant to distract her, and Katherine was grateful. When they reached Denver, Preston did not head toward the town center. Instead, he guided them to a modest office on a side street. A sign above the door read, "Samuel Brooks, Attorney at Law." Katherine looked at Preston with confusion. He dismounted and came around to help her down, his hands steady on her waist. "Thomas Keller's journal is a legal document," he explained. "Thornton accused you of forgery, but he provided no evidence. Meanwhile, you have your father's entire journal showing years of entries in the same hand. I think a real lawyer, not just a town council, might see things differently." Hope flickered in Katherine's chest, immediately followed by crushing doubt. "Cannot pay," she managed to say. "Let me worry about that," Preston said. "Sometimes justice is more valuable than gold." Samuel Brooks turned out to be a middle-aged man with kind eyes and ink-stained fingers. He listened as Preston explained the situation, occasionally glancing at Katherine with sympathy. When Preston finished, Brooks held out his hand for the journal. "May I examine this?" he asked Katherine directly. She handed it over, watching nervously as he flipped through the pages. He paused at several entries, comparing the handwriting, checking dates. Finally, he looked up. "Miss Keller, this journal is clearly genuine. The wear patterns, the consistency of the handwriting over years, the casual nature of many entries. No forger could create something this authentic. Moreover, your father's entry about the water rights is crystal clear. He specifically states that he will allow Thornton to access the stream for his personal use, but that ownership of the water rights remains with the Keller Ranch." Katherine felt her heart pounding. She wanted to ask what this meant, but the words tangled before they could form. Brooks seemed to understand. "What I am saying, Miss Keller, is that the town council made a legal error. You have grounds to appeal their decision. I would be willing to represent you." "But," Katherine forced out, her face already flushing with the effort, I cannot speak, to testify." "You would not need to," Brooks said gently. "Your father's journal speaks for you. I would present the evidence and make the arguments. You would only need to affirm that the journal is genuine, which you can do with a simple yes or no. Do you think you could manage that?" Katherine looked at Preston, who nodded encouragingly. "You can do this," he said quietly. "I know you can." She took a deep breath and looked back at Brooks. "Yes," she said, the word emerging clearly. Brooks smiled. "Then we have a case. I will file the appeal immediately. The territorial judge will be in Denver next month. We will present before him instead of the town council." As they left the lawyer's office, Katherine felt as if she were floating. Preston was grinning, his entire face lit with triumph. Without thinking, Katherine grabbed his arm and he covered her hand with his own. "You see," he said, "not everything is lost. Sometimes you just need someone willing to fight beside you." They were halfway back to the ranch when they encountered Cyrus Thornton on the road. He was accompanied by 2 ranch hands, rough-looking men who eyed Preston with obvious suspicion. Thornton's weasel face twisted into a sneer when he saw Katherine. "Still clinging to that worthless land, girl," he called out. "I told you I would buy it from you. Offer still stands, though the price has gone down. $50 for the whole property." "That land is worth 20 times that, and you know it," Preston said, his voice level but hard. Thornton looked Preston up and down. "Who are you supposed to be?" "Someone who recognizes theft when he sees it," Preston replied. Thornton's face darkened. You want to be careful, stranger. Denver is not kind to drifters who stick their noses where they do not belong. Maybe you should move along to wherever you were headed and leave the girl to sort her own problems. The lady's problems are being sorted, Preston said, by a lawyer. Miss Keller is appealing the council's decision. When the territorial judge sees her father's journal, I expect he will see right through your lies. For a moment, real fear flashed across Thornton's face. Then it hardened into fury. You are making a mistake, both of you. I have friends in this territory, and they do not take kindly to people who cause trouble. Neither do I, Preston said. His hand rested casually on his thigh, inches from his gun. He did not touch the weapon, but the implication was clear. Thornton stared at him for a long moment, then yanked his horse's reins and rode past them, his men following. As they disappeared down the road, Katherine released a breath she had not realized she was holding. That man is dangerous, Preston said quietly. We will need to be careful. The word "we" struck Katherine with sudden warmth. Preston had not said "you." He had said "we," including himself in her struggle as naturally as breathing. She wanted to thank him, to tell him that his presence had changed everything, that for the first time in weeks she felt something other than despair. But the words were too big, too complex, so she simply moved her horse closer to his and let their legs brush as they rode side by side. Over the following weeks, Katherine found herself watching Preston with increasing fascination. He worked with a quiet competence that reminded her of her father, but there was something else too, a gentleness in how he handled the animals, a patience in how he waded through her halting attempts at conversation. He never finished her sentences or looked away in discomfort. He simply waited, his blue eyes steady, until she found the words she needed. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, Preston asked her about her childhood. Katherine had written out many stories in preparation for moments like this, but Preston shook his head. I would rather hear you tell it, he said. If you are willing, I do not mind waiting. So Katherine talked, and it was halting and difficult, full of long pauses and repeated syllables. She told him about her mother, who had died when Katherine was only 5, about the fever that nearly killed her at age 7 and left her with her stutter, about her father's infinite patience and the way he had taught her to read the land and the sky. Preston listened to every word, his attention never wavering, his expression showing only genuine interest. When she finally fell silent, exhausted from the effort, Preston said, Your father sounds like he was a remarkable man. You were lucky to have him, and he was lucky to have you. Katherine felt tears welling up. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. You know what I notice, Preston continued softly. When you talk about things you love, the words come easier. Not easy, I know, but easier, like your passion gives you strength. Katherine had never thought about it that way, but he was right. When she was anxious or scared, her stutter was nearly debilitating. But when she spoke of her father or the ranch or the horses, the words flowed more freely. What do you love, Preston? She managed to ask. He was quiet for a moment, staring out at the darkening mountains. I used to think I loved wandering, he said finally. I have been drifting for 7 years, since my sister died and my parents did not know how to look at me anymore without seeing her absence. I convinced myself that freedom was found in movement, in never staying long enough to feel pain. But lately I have been wondering if maybe I was just running away. From what? Katherine asked. From caring too much, Preston said. From the risk of losing someone again. If you never stay, you never have to say goodbye. He turned to look at her, and in the fading light his eyes were impossibly blue. But being here these past weeks, I have realized something. Running keeps you safe, but it also keeps you alone, and alone is just another kind of death. Catherine's heart was beating so hard she was sure he must hear it. She wanted to tell him that she understood, that she had been alone even when her father was alive, because no one else saw her as anything but her stutter. She wanted to say that his presence had awakened something in her she had not known was sleeping. But the words were impossibly complex, so she reached out and placed her hand over his. Preston looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her face. Slowly, giving her time to pull away, he raised his other hand and gently touched her cheek. His palm was rough with calluses but warm, and Katherine found herself leaning into the touch. "Katherine," he said, and her name in his voice was like music. "I need you to know that I see you. Not your stutter, not your struggles. You, and what I see is brave and strong and beautiful." A tear slipped down her cheek and Preston caught it with his thumb. Katherine wanted to kiss him more than she had ever wanted anything, but fear held her frozen. What if her inexperience repulsed him? What if she tried to speak in the moment and ruined everything? But Preston seemed to sense her hesitation. He leaned forward slowly, telegraphing his intention, giving her every opportunity to pull back. When his lips finally met hers, it was gentle and sweet, a question rather than a demand. Katherine answered by kissing him back, her hand coming up to tangle in his dark hair. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "I think I am done running," he whispered. Katherine could not speak past the emotion clogging her throat, so she kissed him again, hoping he could feel everything she could not say. The next few weeks passed in a blur of work and stolen moments. During the day, they labored side by side to keep the ranch running, and Katherine marveled at how natural it felt to have Preston there. He anticipated her needs and matched her rhythm as if they had been working together for years rather than weeks. In the evenings, they sat together and talked, or rather Preston talked and Katherine added what she could. And slowly she found herself speaking more freely than she ever had with anyone but her father. Preston told her about growing up in Missouri, about his sister Emma, who had been born with a twisted leg and a speech impediment that made her difficult to understand. He described how other children had been cruel, how even adults had treated Emma as if she were simple-minded rather than just physically different. He told Katherine about the day Emma died at 14, falling from a horse she should never have been pressured to ride, pushed by children mocking her into proving she could do things she was not capable of. "I was 16, Preston said, his voice raw. "Old enough to have protected her better, but I did not. I let other people's cruelty go unchallenged because I was afraid of being targeted myself. After she died, I could not stand to be around my parents. Every time they looked at me, I saw the accusation in their eyes. Why Emma and not you? Why did you survive when she did not? So I left." Katherine took his hand. "Not your fault," she said firmly. "I know that now," Preston said. "Or I am learning to know it. Being here, helping you stand up to people like Thornton, it feels like I am finally doing what I should have done for Emma. Maybe that is why I cannot leave. Maybe helping you is helping me too." The day of the hearing before the territorial judge arrived with unseasonable heat. Katherine dressed in her best clothes, a simple gray dress her father had bought her for church, and tried to calm her racing heart. Preston had polished his boots and wore a clean shirt, looking so handsome that Katherine could barely breathe when she saw him. "You ready?" he asked gently. She nodded, though she felt anything but ready. Samuel Brooks met them at the courthouse, a sturdy brick building that also served as Denver's seat of territorial government. Unlike the town council chamber, this room was formal and imposing, with high ceilings and the seal of Colorado Territory hanging on the wall. Judge Henry Morrison, no relation to the council president, was an older man with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness. The hearing began with Brooks presenting the case. He laid out the timeline of events, showed the judge Thomas Keller's journal, and explained how the town council had ruled against clear written evidence. Thornton's lawyer, a slick man named Whitmore, argued that the journal could have been altered after Thomas's death, and that his client had acted in good faith based on a verbal agreement. Finally, Judge Morrison looked directly at Katherine. "Miss Keller, I need to ask you a few questions directly. Your lawyer indicated you have difficulty with speech. Is that correct?" Katherine nodded, her stomach churning. "I need verbal confirmation," the judge said, not unkindly. "For the record." "Yes," Katherine forced out. "Did you alter any entries in your father's journal after his death?" "No," she said clearly. "Is the handwriting in this journal your father's?" "Yes." "And did your father, to your knowledge, ever give Cyrus Thornton exclusive rights to the stream water?" "No," Katherine said, and this time her voice was strong. Thornton leaped to his feet. "Your Honor, how can we trust the testimony of a woman who can barely speak? She is clearly defective. For all we know, she does not even understand the questions being asked." Judge Morrison's eyes went cold. "Mr. Thornton, you will sit down and you will not speak again unless I address you directly." Miss Keller answered 3 questions clearly and directly. Her manner of speech is irrelevant to her credibility. Thornton sat, his face purple with rage. The judge examined the journal for several long minutes, comparing entries from different years. Finally, he looked up. "I find the evidence overwhelming. This journal is clearly genuine, and it clearly states that Thomas Keller retained water rights to the stream in question. The town council's ruling is overturned. Miss Keller's water rights are hereby confirmed, and Mr. Thornton is ordered to cease any interference with her access to the stream." Katherine felt as if her bones had turned to water. Preston grabbed her hand and squeezed, and when she looked at him, he was grinning so wide it must have hurt. As they left the courthouse, Brooks shook both their hands. "Justice," he said with satisfaction. "It does not always win, but today it did." They were walking toward their horses when Thornton intercepted them, his 2 ranch hands flanking him. Up close, Katherine could see that his eyes were wild with fury. "You think you won," he hissed. "You think this is over. I will make you regret this, both of you." "Is that a threat?" Preston asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "It is a promise," Thornton spat. "Accidents happen on ranches all the time. Animals get spooked, barns catch fire, people disappear." Preston moved so fast Katherine almost did not see it. One moment he was standing beside her. The next he had Thornton pinned against the courthouse wall, his forearm across the other man's throat. "Listen very carefully," Preston said, his voice carrying a weight Katherine had never heard before. "If anything happens to Miss Keller, to her animals, to her property, or to me, I have a letter depositing with Samuel Brooks detailing this conversation. The territorial marshal is a personal friend of mine from Wyoming. He would be very interested to hear about threats of arson and murder. Do you understand me?" Thornton's face was turning red, but he managed to nod. Preston released him and stepped back, his hand resting on his gun. "Let's go, Katherine," he said, taking her arm. They rode out of Denver in tense silence. Katherine kept expecting to hear hoofbeats behind them, kept imagining Thornton and his men coming after them. But the road remained empty, and eventually the tension began to drain from her shoulders. "I am sorry you had to see that," Preston said once they were well clear of town. "I do not usually resort to violence, but men like Thornton only understand force." "You protected me," Katherine said simply. "I will always protect you," Preston replied, and the certainty in his voice made Katherine's heart soar. That night they celebrated with a special supper. Preston had bought a bottle of wine in town, and they sat on the porch watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The victory felt surreal, and Katherine kept expecting to wake up and find it was all a dream. "What will you do now?" Preston asked. "You have your water rights back. With proper management, this ranch could thrive." Katherine heard the question he was not asking. What will we do? Would Preston stay, or would he continue his journey to California? The thought of him leaving made her chest ache, but she had no right to ask him to stay. He had already done so much for her. "I want to stay," Preston said, as if reading her mind. "If you want me to. Not just as a ranch hand, Katherine. I want to stay because I am falling in love with you." Katherine's breath caught. She wanted to say that she loved him too, that she had started falling the day he sat across from her and waited patiently for her words. But love was such a huge word, and her tongue felt thick with emotion. Preston seemed to understand. He took her hands in his. "You do not have to say anything right now. I just needed you to know. I am tired of running, tired of being alone. I want to build something real. I want to build it here with you if you will have me." Katherine's eyes filled with tears. She opened her mouth and forced out the words one at a time, each one a battle, but a battle worth fighting. "I love you too." Preston's face transformed with joy. He pulled her close and kissed her, and Katherine kissed him back with all the passion she had been holding inside. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Preston laughed and picked her up, spinning her around until she was laughing too, the sound bubbling up from deep inside her. They spent that night talking about the future, about expanding the herd, about building a better irrigation system, about all the possibilities that had seemed impossible just weeks before. Katherine found herself speaking more freely than ever, her excitement overcoming her anxiety. Preston listened to every word, his eyes never leaving her face, and Katherine felt more seen and understood than she had in her entire life. The weeks that followed were hard work, but joyful. True to his threat, Thornton tried several times to cause trouble, sending his men to harass Katherine's cattle or block access to the stream. But Preston was always there, and his reputation as someone not to be trifled with quickly spread. After the third confrontation, Thornton seemed to realize he was beaten and retreated to his own property. Summer arrived with blazing heat, but the stream flowed strong and clear through Katherine's land, and her cattle grew fat and healthy. Preston proved to be everything she had hoped, a skilled rancher who loved the land as much as she did. He was also patient and kind, never pushing her to speak more than she was comfortable with, but always encouraging her to try. One evening in late July, Preston rode into the yard with a wild look in his eyes. Katherine ran out to meet him, alarmed by his expression. "What happened?" she asked. "I was in town buying supplies," Preston said, dismounting quickly. "I ran into a man I used to work with in Wyoming. He told me something you need to know." Katherine's stomach clenched. "What?" Preston took her hands. "Katherine, I lied to you, not about anything important," he added quickly, seeing her expression, "but about why I came to Colorado. The truth is, I was running from something. I got into trouble in Wyoming, defending a Shoshone family from some ranch hands who were harassing them. One of the hands pulled a gun and I shot him. I did not kill him, but I injured him badly. His family has money and influence, and they put a price on my head." Katherine stared at him, processing this information. "You could have told me," she said slowly. "I know," Preston said. "I should have, but I was afraid. Afraid you would send me away, afraid you would see me as a violent man. But I cannot keep secrets from you, Katherine. You deserve the truth. The man I saw in town recognized me. Word will spread. I may need to leave to keep you safe." "No," Katherine said firmly. Preston blinked. Catherine, if bounty hunters come here, if that family sends men after me, you could be in danger." "No," Catherine repeated. She took a breath and forced out the words. "You do not run, we fight together." Preston's eyes widened. Then he pulled her into a fierce embrace. "Are you sure? This could get dangerous." Catherine pulled back just enough to look him in the eyes. "You stayed for me, I stay for you." The look Preston gave her was full of such love and wonder that Catherine felt her heart might burst. He kissed her deeply, and she kissed him back, trying to pour everything she felt into the gesture. In the end, the trouble Preston feared never materialized. Samuel Brooks, at Preston's request, contacted the territorial marshal and explained the situation. The marshal investigated and determined that Preston had acted in self-defense. The charges in Wyoming were dropped, and the bounty was lifted. When Brooks delivered the news, Preston actually sagged with relief. "I have been running for so long," he told Catherine that night. "I forgot what it felt like to stand still, to stand and fight for something that matters." Catherine understood. In her own way, she had been running too, retreating from a world that mocked her differences, hiding away on her ranch where she did not have to face scorn and pity. But Preston had shown her that there was another way. That standing and fighting, facing down cruelty and injustice, was possible even for someone like her. As summer faded into autumn, Preston asked Catherine to marry him. He did it simply, without grand gestures, on an ordinary evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. He took her hand and said, "I want to spend my life with you. Will you marry me?" Catherine did not hesitate. "Yes," she said, and the word came out clear and strong. They were married in October in a small ceremony at the Denver church. Samuel Brooks stood as Preston's witness, and Mrs. Henshaw, who had apologized profusely for her daughter's cruelty, stood as Catherine's. The preacher who married them was the same one who had known Catherine since childhood, and he spoke the words of the ceremony slowly, giving Catherine time to repeat her vows without rushing. When the preacher said, "You may kiss your bride," Preston cupped Catherine's face gently and kissed her with such tenderness that several people in the small congregation were moved to tears. Catherine kissed him back, feeling for the first time in her life completely and utterly at peace. The years that followed were not without challenges. Ranching was hard work, and there were droughts and harsh winters and all the difficulties that came with trying to make a living from the land. But Preston and Catherine faced everything together, their partnership strengthening with each obstacle they overcame. Catherine's stutter never went away completely, but it improved over time as her confidence grew. She learned that with Preston beside her, she could face even the people of Denver who had once mocked her. Some of them apologized. Others never did. But Catherine found that their opinions mattered less and less. She had a husband who loved her, a ranch that thrived, and a life she had built through courage and determination. 3 years after their wedding, Catherine gave birth to a daughter. They named her Emma after Preston's sister, and the baby had her father's blue eyes and her mother's auburn hair. Preston cried when he held his daughter for the first time, and Catherine understood. This was healing for him, a chance to honor his sister's memory by raising his own daughter to be confident and strong. Emma was followed 2 years later by a son they named Thomas, after Catherine's father. And then 3 years after that, another daughter, Grace. The house that had once been so quiet filled with laughter and noise and the beautiful chaos of family life. Preston proved to be a wonderful father, patient and playful. He taught his children to ride and rope and read the land, just as Thomas Keller had taught Catherine. And Catherine, despite her stutter, told her children stories every night, stories of their grandfather and their Aunt Emma, stories of the ranch and the West, stories of courage and love. The children noticed that their mother spoke differently, of course, but it was simply part of who she was, like her red hair or her green eyes. Preston's response whenever anyone asked about it set the tone for how they understood it. "Your mother has a beautiful voice," he would say. "We just need to be patient to hear all the beautiful things she has to say." Emma, the eldest, inherited her mother's stutter to a mild degree. When she grew anxious about it, Katherine would sit with her and tell her stories of her own struggles and how she had overcome them. "Words are hard sometimes," Katherine would say carefully, "but what matters is what you say, not how fast you say it, and anyone worth talking to will wait." The ranch prospered beyond Katherine's early hopes. With proper water access and Preston's skill with cattle, they expanded their herd and eventually bought additional land. They hired ranch hands to help with the work, and Katherine made sure to pay them fairly and treat them with respect. Remembering what it felt like to be dismissed and undervalued, Cyrus Thornton's ranch, ironically, failed within 5 years. His cruel management and dishonest practices caught up with him, and he was forced to sell at a loss and leave Colorado. Katherine felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only relief that he could no longer threaten her family. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Preston surprised Katherine with a gift. He had commissioned a local craftsman to carve a sign for the ranch entrance. It read Keller Emory Ranch in bold letters, with a smaller inscription below, "Built on courage and sustained by love." Katherine cried when she saw it, and Preston held her close. "You taught me what courage looks like," he said. "You stand up every day and face a world that is not always kind, and you do it with grace and strength. I am so proud to stand beside you." Katherine looked up at him, this man who had wandered into her life when she was at her lowest point and chosen to stay. She thought of all the words she had struggled to say over the years, all the thoughts that had tangled in her throat. But there was one word that had always come easily with Preston, from that first day on the porch when he had waited patiently for her to speak. "Love," she said, the single word encompassing everything. "I love you." "I love you too," Preston said, and kissed her beneath the sign that would mark their ranch for generations to come. As the years continued to pass, Katherine and Preston's love only deepened. They grew old together, watching their children grow and eventually have children of their own. The ranch remained in the family, passing from one generation to the next, each one adding their own chapter to its story. Emma, their eldest, married a gentle school teacher who loved her completely and never minded her occasional stutter. She became a teacher herself, specializing in helping children with speech difficulties. Thomas took over the ranch operations, proving to have his grandfather's gift with the land and his father's skill with horses. Grace, the youngest and most adventurous, became a nurse and traveled throughout Colorado territory, providing medical care to isolated ranching and mining communities. Katherine lived to see all her children settled and happy, and to hold 7 grandchildren in her arms. Preston remained her constant companion, still patient, still waiting for her words, still loving her with the same intensity he had shown that first day when he looked past her stutter and saw her. On a cool autumn evening when Katherine was 63 years old, she and Preston sat on the same porch where they had shared their first kiss decades earlier. Their hair was gray now, their hands marked with age and work, but they still held hands and watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "Do you ever regret staying?" Katherine asked. Her stutter had mellowed with age, the words coming slower but easier. "You were heading to California. You could have seen the ocean, had adventures." Preston turned to look at her, his blue eyes still sharp despite his years. "Katherine, my greatest adventure was building a life with you." The ocean would have been pretty, but it would have been empty without you beside me. I found exactly what I was looking for the day I rode into this ranch. I found home." Katherine leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart. She thought of that desperate girl she had been, standing before the town council and choking on her words, certain that her life was over. She thought of the cruelty she had faced and the loneliness she had endured. And then she thought of Preston, riding into her life at the exact moment she needed him most, seeing her worth when the world saw only her flaws. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for waiting." Preston kissed the top of her head. "I would have waited forever," he said. "Every word was worth it." They sat together as the stars emerged one by one, two people who had found in each other what they both needed most. For Preston, it was a reason to stop running and build something lasting. For Katherine, it was someone who saw past her struggles to the strength beneath. Together, they had created a legacy not just of land and cattle, but of love, courage, and the simple, profound act of being patient with one another. The Keller Emory Ranch continued for many years after Katherine and Preston were laid to rest side by side on a hillside overlooking the land they had fought to keep. Their children and grandchildren told stories of the stuttering ranch woman and the wandering cowboy who loved her, stories that became family legend and then local history. In Denver, which grew from a frontier town into a prosperous city, old-timers still remembered the day Katherine Keller stood before the territorial judge and spoke her truth in a handful of clear, brave words. Some who had mocked her in the town council chamber lived long enough to feel ashamed of their cruelty. Others never gave it another thought, but Katherine had long since stopped caring about their opinions. The children and grandchildren of Katherine and Preston Emory inherited more than land and livestock. They inherited the understanding that strength comes in many forms, that love is patient and kind, and that sometimes the most profound acts of courage involve simply standing your ground and speaking your truth, one word at a time. And on quiet evenings when the wind blows down from the mountains and across the grasslands of Colorado, if you stand on that hillside where Katherine and Preston rest, you can almost hear the echo of patient words spoken in love. A cowboy's voice saying, "I will wait," and a woman's voice answering, halting but clear, "I love you." The ranch sign, weathered but still standing after more than a century, continues to mark the place where two lonely people found each other and built something beautiful. Built on courage and sustained by love, the inscription reads, and it remains true to this day. For love, like Katherine and Preston's, does not fade with time. It echoes through generations, a reminder that the greatest adventures are not found in distant places, but in the daily choice to see, to wait, and to love another person completely, exactly as they are. Their story became more than just a family tale. It became a testament to the power of patience and acceptance in a world that often values speed and conformity above all else. Katherine, who had been cast out and mocked for her differences, became a symbol of strength to others who struggled. Preston, who had been running from his past, became an example of how standing still and committing to something real can be the bravest choice of all. In the end, their love story was simple but profound. A woman who struggled to speak, and a man who was willing to listen. A woman who had lost everything, and a man who was searching for something worth holding on to. They found each other at exactly the right moment, in a dusty ranch in Colorado territory, and they built a life together that outlasted mountains and rivers. When their great-grandchildren gathered at the ranch for reunions, they would walk up to that hillside and stand before the two simple headstones. Katherine Keller Emory, the stones read, "Her words were few but mighty." And beside it, Preston Emory, "He waited with love." Those simple epitaphs captured everything that mattered. Katherine had learned that her worth was not measured by how fluently she spoke, but by the courage with which she lived. Preston had learned that running away from pain also meant running away from joy, and that the deepest fulfillment came from staying and fighting for what mattered most. Their legacy lived on not just in the ranch that still bore their names, but in the descendants who carried their lessons forward. Emma's great-granddaughter became a speech therapist, helping hundreds of children find their voices. Thomas's grandson started a foundation that provided legal aid to small ranchers facing unjust legal challenges. Grace's descendants continued her tradition of service, becoming doctors and nurses and teachers who treated everyone with dignity regardless of their circumstances. But perhaps the most important legacy was the simplest one. In the Keller Emory family, patience was not just a virtue but a way of life. Spouses waited for each other. Parents waited for their children. Friends waited for friends. They had learned from Katherine and Preston that waiting for someone, really waiting with full attention and love, was not a burden but a gift. The story of Katherine and Preston spread beyond their family, becoming one of those tales that people told to illustrate what real love looked like. It was not the flashy romance of dime novels or the dramatic passion of stage plays. It was quiet and steady, built on daily choices to see the best in each other, to support each other through hardship, and to never give up on each other even when the world made that the easier choice. Young couples starting out would hear the story and understand that lasting love was not about finding someone perfect, but about finding someone who would stand beside you through imperfection. Parents raising difficult children would remember Katherine's stutter and Preston's patience, and find the strength to love through the challenges. People facing their own struggles and differences would hear how Katherine refused to let the world's cruelty define her, and they would find courage to stand tall in their own truth. The ranch itself remained a working operation for over 150 years, adapting with the times but never losing its essential character. The house was expanded and modernized, but the original structure remained at its heart. The barn that Preston had repaired was eventually replaced, but timbers from the original were incorporated into the new structure. The stream that had been the source of so much conflict continued to flow clear and cold, feeding cattle and crops, and reminding everyone who lived there of the importance of fighting for what was right. In the Colorado State Historical Society archives, there are records of the legal battle that established Katherine's water rights, records that are still cited in property law cases today. Samuel Brooks wrote about the case in his memoirs, noting that it was one of the most satisfying victories of his legal career not because of its complexity but because of its clarity. "Justice," he wrote, "should not require eloquence, only truth. Katherine Keller taught me that." The town of Denver, which had been so cruel to Katherine in her moment of need, eventually erected a small monument to her and other pioneering women who had shaped Colorado's history. It was a small acknowledgement, far too late to matter to Katherine herself, but it represented a shift in how the community understood its own past and the often overlooked contributions of women who had built the West alongside men. But all the historical markers and monuments and legal precedents, while important, captured only the surface of what Katherine and Preston's story really meant. At its heart, their story was about something much simpler and more profound. It was about being seen. Katherine had spent most of her life invisible to the people around her, reduced to her stutter, dismissed as defective or pitiable. Preston saw her. He saw her intelligence and strength, her skill with the land and animals, her fierce love for her father and her home. He saw her beauty, inside and out. And in being seen, Katherine found the courage to see herself clearly too, not as the broken thing the world tried to make her, but as the capable, lovable woman she truly was. For Preston, being with Katherine allowed him to see himself clearly as well. He had been running from the guilt and pain of his sister's death, convinced he was a coward who did not deserve peace. But Katherine showed him that courage was not about never being afraid or never making mistakes. It was about standing up and trying again, about using past pain to fuel present compassion. In fighting for Katherine, Preston finally forgave himself for not fighting hard enough for Emma. Their story, passed down through generations and recorded in family histories and legal documents and local legends, became a touchstone for what love should look like. Not perfect, not easy, but real. Patient, courageous, kind. Built on mutual respect, and sustained by daily choices to honor and support each other. And so the story of the stuttering ranch woman and the patient cowboy lived on, long after they themselves had passed into memory. It lived on in the ranch that still bore their names, in the descendants who carried their lessons, in the legal precedents they established, and most importantly, in the hearts of everyone who heard their story and understood its message. True love waits. True love sees. True love stands and fights when running would be easier. True love recognizes that our differences are not defects, but simply part of what makes us human. True love is patient enough to wait for every word, and brave enough to keep speaking even when words come hard. On that hillside overlooking the ranch, where Katherine and Preston rest side by side, the wind still blows down from the mountains. The grass still grows green in spring and golden in autumn. The stream still flows clear and cold. And if you listen closely on quiet evenings, you might hear the echo of a story that refuses to end, a story of courage and patience and love that transcends time itself. A woman who struggled to speak, a man who learned to listen, two people who found each other and built something beautiful. That was the story of Katherine and Preston Emory, and it remains a story worth telling. A reminder that the best adventures are often found not in distant lands, but in the daily choice to love one another well. Their love transformed not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone they touched. It rippled outward through generations, teaching that patience is a form of love, that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most profound act of rebellion is simply refusing to accept the world's judgment of your worth. Katherine Keller, who had been mocked and cast out, who had struggled every day with a tongue that would not obey, lived a life of profound impact. She raised strong children, built a thriving ranch, established legal precedents that protected property rights, and most importantly, loved and was loved completely. Preston Emory, who had been running from his pain, found the courage to stop and build something lasting. Together, they proved that happiness is not found in perfection but in acceptance, not in ease but in choosing to face challenges together, and that, in the end, was their legacy. Not just land or cattle or legal precedents, but a living demonstration of what love looks like when it is true. Patient, kind, courageous, willing to wait for every word and brave enough to keep speaking even when speaking is hard. A love that says, I see you, all of you, and I choose to stay. A love that transforms two lonely people into a family into a community, and a struggle into a triumph. The story of Katherine and Preston Emory reminds us that we are all worth waiting for, that our struggles do not define our value, and that sometimes the person we need most will arrive exactly when we are ready to give up hope. It reminds us that love is not about finding someone perfect, but about finding someone who will stand beside us through imperfection. And it reminds us that the greatest adventures are not always found in distant places, but sometimes right where we are, in the daily choice to see each other clearly and love each other well. Their story continues, passed from grandparent to grandchild, told around dinner tables and campfires, recorded in histories and memories. And as long as people tell stories of courage and love, as long as people remember that patience is a virtue and kindness is strength, the story of the stuttering ranch woman and the cowboy who waited for every word will endure, a testament to the transformative power of love that sees, accepts, and chooses to stay.